Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our Heal Connections sharing session. Today's session is the first part of a two-part series on community partner insights to strengthen research dissemination. Today's focus will be on pain. In October, we'll host part 2 of this series, and the focus that month will be on opioid use disorder. I'm Sierra, and I'm one of today's moderators. I'm an assistant research scientist at Chestnut Health Systems, and I help with the Heal Connections Lived Experience panel as a facilitator. I'm also a person in long-term recovery from substance use disorder. I'll now turn it over to Eden, who will serve as the other moderator of today's discussion.
Thank you, Sierra. Hi, everyone. I'm Eden Buell, and I'm with Chestnut Health Systems as well. I'm also one of the facilitators of the Heal Connections Lived Experience panel. I also have direct and indirect lived experience with chronic pain conditions and substance use disorder. In today's session, we are joined by Helen Skipper, the Executive Director of the New York City Justice Peer Initiative and a person with living experience of pain. We also have Erin Lee, a pre-med student at Boston University and a person with living experience of pain. We have Chris Beasley, the co-founder and director of the Chronic Pain Research Alliance, and Kavitha Nirakonda, the Associate Executive Director of Quality and Research Initiatives at the American Academy of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation. So for today's agenda, each of the panelists will give brief remarks to introduce themselves. Afterwards, we'll dive into our panel discussion, followed by a Q&A session. I encourage all of you to ask questions in the chat throughout the sharing session, and we'll address those questions during the open Q&A session. So today we're excited to learn from our panelists about the best formats and channels for engaging communities in research and sharing results. By the end of this meeting, we'll hope you have gained insight on successful approaches to identifying and engaging stakeholders to research communities and populations experiencing pain to bring back to your own research teams and specific projects. So I'm really excited because now we're going to hear from our first panelist, Skipper, one of our lived experience panel members.
Hello, everybody. I just want to say how grateful I am to be here. Ashley, I see you. How you doing? So what I want to talk about is struggling with pain while also being in recovery. So I have a multitude of lived experiences. I'm a criminologist. I will be applying for my doctorate this year, as soon as I graduate with my master's this year as well. I also have lived experience in the criminal justice system. As a researcher, as someone with lived experience who has effectively moved my lived experience to professional lived expertise, I remember back in the days when I had first leaned into recovery. Oh yeah, did I mention that I am also in long-term recovery? I've been in recovery since 2007. It wasn't that hard to get in recovery, even though it took me 25 years of going in and out of systems to finally lean into recovery. What was hard was staying and keeping with my recovery principles. When I experienced a medical emergency, a condition, I have a rare kidney condition that came with a lot of pain. And what I had to learn how to navigate by myself. So we had nothing like Heal Connections, and thank you so much for doing this. But what I had to navigate by myself was being in recovery, learning about myself, learning about mind and mood altering substances, and discovering that I no longer wanted them in my body. I no longer wanted to ingest them. And that was part of my recovery process. I also suffer from a mental illness, and I even reflected that on my processes with behavioral health. Was that if I'm not putting any mind and mood altering substances in my body, that even includes these psychotropic meds that they gave me, and how do I navigate away from that? And using my recovery principles, I was able to navigate away from that. I've been clean since 2007. In 2012, I experienced a medical emergency that went from 2012 until about 2017, where I constantly experienced chronic pain. And of course, they wanted to give me pain medication. And for a long time, I said no. But I said no to the detriment of myself. So there was many times that I cried myself to sleep because the pain was just tremendous. Nobody helped me navigate how does a person being in recovery, but now suffering from a medical emergency, suffering from a medical need. This is not for pleasure, this is for pain. How do I navigate, negotiate what I felt was losing my recovery, losing my clean time in order to take an opioid pain medication? And I went back and forth with that. I wasn't right with it. Matter of fact, I actually was hiding from my doctors the fact that I was in recovery because the stigma involved with that. And maybe if I'd have said I was in recovery, they might not have. But then again, the type of pain I was in, they surely would have recommended me to take this medication. But nobody talked to me. Nobody helped me run through these processes in my mind. Nobody gave me support and assistance. Nobody let me know that pain from a medical condition, and to be able to alleviate yourself of to live a pain-free life would not take you out of the recovery process. And I felt for sure it did. I felt I was losing my clean time, the time that I had fought day in and day out. I just knew that it was a relapse. Put it this way, it was a relapse because there was no information available. There was no information available. There was nobody available to talk to me. I have all the lived experience in the world, but as people know, sometimes with lived experience comes some instances of stigma where if you want to be unapologetic about that lived experience, but then again, you also want to hold some parts of that back because you feel it would hold you back. So I managed to navigate that, and I want to say not in the right way. I hid the fact that I was in recovery from my physician. I allowed them to prescribe me the pain meds and spent many a night racked in immense pain. And I'm talking about from open surgeries, from my stomach being slit open, refusing to even push the pump on the morphine drip, refusing to ring the bell and call for the nurse, and instead just begging for someone to come and take me out of this, and even wanting to take myself out of this. Fast forward to today, we now have these entities like Heal Connection. We have lived experience and living experience advisory boards where our voices are welcome. And they want to know about our experiences. They want to know about how we navigated and made it through. What helped us? What helped me today reconciling myself with these things from the past is being involved in these lived experience advisory boards, is speaking my truth. And my truth is for anyone who has ever suffered from any type of pain while being in recovery. Like, talk about it. Talk to your support system. Build a support system, because you will find in many cases that it is okay to do what the physician says and to not have to put yourself through nights and nights of nerve-wracking pain where you're on the ground crying, just begging for relief. It's okay. And that is the beauty of Heal Connections. And I'm so grateful to be involved in this, is to let people know that it's okay. It's okay to seek relief. Oh, by the way, I never talked about who I was. So sorry, my name is Skip. I'm the executive director of the New York City Justice Peer Initiative. I also said that I am a master's student getting ready to enter into my doctorate in criminology. I have lived experience. I spent 25 years going in and out of the criminal justice, the substance abuse, and the mental health systems. I'm also the vice chair of the New York City Board of Corrections. And I'm a person who firmly believes that lived experience is truly professional lived expertise, and everything I do, my passion, my work, my school, my research comes out of my lived experience. So if you have lived experience, be unapologetic like me, and don't be afraid to speak on it because you are going to help 15 million other people. Thank you.
Wow, Skip, that was awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us and being here today. That was awesome. So I guess next up, we'll talk to Erin Lee.
Hi, everyone. My name is Erin. I was born and raised in Brookline, Massachusetts, and I'm currently a rising senior at Boston University studying psychology on the pre-med track. My long-term goal is to obtain an MD, MPH, and become a physician scientist. And I actually just took the MCAT last Friday, and I'll be applying to medical school in the spring. So I'm here to talk about my chronic pain journey and how that's kind of shaped my perspective on research and research dissemination. So my journey started nearly 8 years ago following a mild concussion in middle school, and I was told that I would be recovering pretty much within a month. But after 3 months and not seeing much improvement, I was diagnosed with post-concussion syndrome, which was only the beginning of a series of chronic conditions that I soon developed. About a month after the concussion, I began experiencing unexplained, debilitating knee pain, which soon developed into full body pain. I somehow developed a mysterious fracture, persistent headaches, and multiple autonomic regulatory issues. I was previously a healthy, active, and happy young girl. I had some health issues here and there, but nothing to the extent that I had was just about to experience. But I quickly became bedridden and depressed and unable to walk or go to school. And over the next few years, aside from physiological conditions, um, such as, the fracture and the knee problem, I was diagnosed with amplified musculoskeletal pain syndrome, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, chronic migraine, mast cell activation syndrome, cyclic vomiting syndrome, IBS-C, and multiple other related conditions. That's only like half of the things that I have. But throughout my journey, my mom and I have worked tirelessly to reestablish a functional lifestyle in spite of my disabilities. I've tried everything you could possibly think of to get better, including physical therapy and aquatic therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, medications and treatments, chiropractic, acupuncture, craniosacral therapy, Reiki, and other holistic medicine practices. Some of it worked and some of it really didn't. In fact, some of the treatments that we tried, both Western and Eastern medicine, made my condition worse. But we did it all because we didn't know what else to do. And I think that's a sentiment that a lot of people with lived experience with chronic pain can relate to. However, the most impactful experience for me was about 6 months into my journey when I attended the comfortability workshop at Boston Children's Hospital. And through this workshop, my mom and I learned so much about the science behind chronic pain, research-backed coping strategies to deal with pain, the value of communication with physicians, teachers, school administrators, friends, and family in the recovery process. And soon after, I was able to get back to a relatively normal lifestyle. I was also afforded the opportunity to participate in the FIT Teen study, which was a multi-site clinical trial that aimed to assess whether a specialized exercise training intervention combined with CBT was superior to either of those treatments alone. And this was a few years into my journey, I think maybe the fourth year. And it came at the perfect time because it really served to reinforce the skills that I had acquired to treat my pain and solidify these practices into my daily routine. And now I regularly attend physical therapy because I was able to experience the benefits of these interventions firsthand. And I think it really helped me understand how important it was in maintaining to participate in these activities in maintaining my functionality. And honestly, my journey has not been linear by any means. I continue to manage a growing number of chronic health conditions, and there have been a few years where I was struggling a lot with my health or missing more school than usual. But because the comfortability workshop, the Fit Teen study, and my wonderful team of providers equipped me with the coping skills I needed, contextualized my journey, what my journey might look like long term, and connected me to valuable resources and research on pain management. I never lost hope, and I managed to keep pushing through it all. I now serve as a peer advisory board member for Comfortability, where I share my story and answer questions to inspire patients who are just starting their recovery. And that ultimately led me to Heal Connections, the Lived Experience panel, and to this webinar today. As proud as I am of the progress that I've made thus far and how far I've come, I also recognize my privilege has played a huge role in my success. Having grown up in Boston, I always had access to some of the best hospitals in the world, where I could easily see doctors and specialists who not only understood my health conditions, but knew how to treat me, or who to refer me to. I was regularly informed about chronic pain research by my physicians, and I had both the time and the energy to actually participate in numerous trials, which allowed me to learn about different forms of treatment and try it out myself. I had a mom who believed in me when I told her I was in pain and made every effort to find answers and advocate for me to get better. And most importantly, my parents were not just willing, but able to take on the cost of my care and had amazing health insurance that made treatment and maintenance as affordable as possible. This is why I believe so strongly in the value of research dissemination, because the vast majority of individuals who experience chronic pain do not have the kind of access and support that I have, and therefore might not be able to adequately treat their pain to begin with. Getting research to these individuals in an accessible manner will make an immeasurable difference for the chronic pain community. As a person with lived experience, it gives me so much hope to see that researchers within this field are actively working towards improving dissemination and implementation. So with that said, I just want to thank you all for attending today's webinar and listening to what we have to say.
Erin, that was awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. So next up, we'll hear from Chris Beasley.
Thanks, Eden, and thanks, Skip and Erin. It's really nice to join both of you here today. As Eden mentioned, my name is Chris Beasley. I'm the co-founder and director of the Chronic Pain Research Alliance. We're an advocacy initiative that works to increase the overall federal research investment in chronic pain. And we also work specifically on a group of conditions called chronic overlapping pain conditions, which are a group of disorders that either solely or predominantly affect women and commonly co-occur. So conditions like migraine headache, fibromyalgia, irritable bowel, low back pain, and a variety of other conditions. And we also work in the space of knowledge translation. So we want to make sure that not only are we advocating for high-level research, but once those findings are out and published, that we're actually getting them into the hands of people who need it. So people who have chronic pain, as well as their providers, insurance companies, and everyone else that's involved in improving healthcare for people with chronic pain. I myself have 30 years of lived experience with chronic pain. I was hit by a car when I was a teenager. It was an accident I was not supposed to survive, but ended up with chronic pain as starting at the age of 17, 18 years old. So I can very much relate to all the experiences that Erin and Skip just shared. Today, I'm representing on this panel as an organizational representative, but certainly have the lived experience perspective as well. I have a science background, and I also partner with about 12 right now academic studies across the United States that are funded by the National Institutes of Health, PCORI, the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Department of Defense, the Food and Drug Administration. And so our organization works in a couple of different ways to make sure that we're getting that information out into the community. One is probably not very different than most advocacy organizations, which is, we obviously put out information through our social media channels, through e-newsletters and direct email to folks who subscribe to get information from us. But as I mentioned earlier, the other way that we more broadly partner with researchers is to be a patient partner in an actual research study, where we are working with investigators from the time that their grant is funded to think about at the end, how are you going to communicate and disseminate this information to the broader public? And so as we as we go along through the study in year 2, year 3, year 4, and finally when it's usually finished in year 5, we already, have a plan in place to think through, who are the groups that need to receive this information. Obviously, patients who suffer from those conditions and clinicians who treat it, but more broadly in the public, is it caregivers, family members, friends? Is it insurance companies? Is it healthcare administrators? And obviously, we can't reach all people with all information unless you have an enormous budget to do so. But you certainly can prioritize who the folks are that most need the information, and to think of creative ways to get that information broadly disseminated to them in a format that they're going to receive. So it's, there are opportunities and there are also barriers, to this work. The opportunity is that there are so many ways nowadays to be able to disseminate information to the community and to the public. And that's also the challenge, right? Because people don't receive information today in the same way. Some people prefer to get it through social media. Other people prefer to read a newspaper. Other people prefer to listen to the news, or, there's a variety of different ways to do that. So really understanding who your audience is and how to work as a research team, embedding, again, that communication and dissemination angle from the very beginning, and understanding how your audiences like to receive information really helps to increase the chance that you're going to be successful in broadly disseminating that information, and that information is actually going to be used to improve the healthcare and quality of life for people who are suffering with chronic pain disorders. So I'm really happy to be here, and I look forward to the rest of the presentations and the question and answer period.
Thank you, Chris. You do such amazing work. We appreciate you. And then we have, last but absolutely not least, Kavitha Nirakonda.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kavitha Nirakonda. I'm the Associate Executive Director of Quality and Research at the American Academy of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation. It's an honor to be here with all the other panelists. I've learned so much just from hearing you talk and preparing for this webinar. So thank you. So who is AAPM&R? AAPM&R is a National Medical Specialty Society that represents all MDs and DOs that are physiatrists, clinicians of physical medicine and rehabilitation. Physiatrists are, like I said, MDs or DOs that specialize in disability and function. Chronic pain is an area of focus for physiatrists as well. So some of the things that I think about daily with my job and working with physicians on a daily basis is, how do we need to shift the traditional ways of conducting and disseminating research? And I do believe we're seeing some shifts in the way that is happening in the medical world. And I think Chris hit on a lot of that as well. Traditionally, we had clinicians who, and we still do this today, that come up with ideas, understand where gaps in care are, and come up with guidance, best practices, clinical guidance in these areas that hopefully get disseminated within the clinical community. And the goal is that, that clinicians would write guidance and research and develop this research for clinicians. And then ultimately, clinicians would hope that their guidance would be disseminated to everyone else, other clinicians that might be impacted, other individuals in the healthcare community, anybody else with a lived experience, et cetera. And the partnership traditionally has happened a little bit later, a little bit like an afterthought. And I mean that in the most sincerest ways, because traditionally research was conducted by clinical researchers and clinicians in a silo. So one of the things that I believe we need to see, and we need to see more of, is really shifting the paradigm of what research is done and how that research is even thought of, and what clinical questions we need to answer, listening to individuals with lived experiences, including those of you who are on this call with us today. So one experience that I can share is during the long COVID, when the pandemic happened, everyone's worlds were turned upside down, and so was ours, and our clinicians were as well. And as individuals with lived experience started experiencing post-COVID syndrome, long-lasting effects, after either having COVID or maybe not even getting a positive test, this chronic pain challenges with them started rising to be an issue with healthcare. And physiatrists started seeing patients asking a lot of questions of them, like, something's going on with me. I don't feel right. I'm extremely fatigued. I used to run all the time and now I can't. And that really sparked us to think about this in a different way. And what really changed here was the impetus for looking at individuals who may have long COVID sparked from those with lived experiences. Research from organizations like the Patient-Led Research Collaborative started publishing material, started developing research, started writing about and sharing about their lived experiences. And that made the medical community wake up and say, how are we going to deal with this? How are we going to work together with these individuals with lived experiences and ensure that clinicians have the tools that they need to work in partnership and in collaboration with their patients? So we embarked on this journey with long COVID, where we worked with patient organizations, provider organizations, and hospital systems to really do a national call to action. That's what medical specialty societies do well. So we tried to focus on our core competencies while partnering and collaborating with organizations like patient advocacy organizations so we could draw upon their core competencies. And what we did was we had over 40 clinics with multidisciplinary clinicians, as well as patients with lived experiences, on a collaborative where we got together every month for 2 hours late at night, and people just started sharing their stories, what they were seeing, what they were experiencing. And that then developed into clinical consensus guidance to help clinicians who were seeing individuals with possibly with long COVID, try to help put some structure around the work that they would do, the goals that they would build with their patients. So through all of that work, we've published over 10 publications to date. We're working on a holistic compendium statement right now. We're very excited to get that published, hopefully by the year end. What this has really taught us, and I know that this is not new, but what this has really taught us, that strong partnerships, multidisciplinary partnerships, bringing individuals with lived experiences need to be at the table during the ideation stage. When researchers, when clinicians are starting to ask clinical questions and think about how we need to answer some of these broader questions or conduct research, we really need to have all voices at the table from the beginning, because that's going to shape the research project to be much more beneficial for everyone involved and hopefully translate into broader dissemination. My mantra is, if they're not at the table from the beginning, it's going to be that much harder to get individuals to disseminate through their channels when the final product is completed. Thank you for allowing me to speak today, and I hope that this talk, amongst many others, will help us forge some partnerships, collaborations, and more conversations.
Thank you so much, Kavitha, for already giving us some insight into this. I just want to give a huge thank you to all of our panelists. Y'all are lucky today because we've had wonderful introductions and all the work that they do. So thank you. And this will lead us to our panel discussion. So before we get started, I just want to give a quick reminder for folks to go ahead and put any of your questions in the chat, and we'll get to them a little later in the Q&A open session. I'd like to start with a question for our lived experience panelists. So we got Aaron and Skip. This one's for you. Thinking specifically about a time when you or a person in your community received information that made a meaningful impact on their pain condition or pain management. How was that information obtained?
So I think for me, it is most helpful when my doctors are aware of the research that's going on. And I think it's most effective for people like me because they're kind of able to translate what a research paper might be saying about a particular treatment or the anatomy of pain and translate it into our lives and make it applicable to our situations, which I think is a huge gap between research and the people that it affects. I think I also definitely rely on other people I know with chronic pain. And I also use the other supportive healthcare services, such as physical therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy, to get some of that information. Because again, like they can kind of explain research findings in a way that makes sense to my life, and in a way that I can incorporate it and actually use what's been found to improve my day-to-day life.
I also want to add that while it's extremely helpful to have a provider that you can talk to, it's even more beneficial and helpful to have a provider that has a finger and a pulse on the community. Even before I divulged to my pain management doctor, and let me just tell you, I've been with that man since 2013, since I came out of the hospital after 5 years of hospitalization. I mean, excuse me, 5 months of hospitalization. I've been with this man since 2013. He just closed his office down in April, and I was devastated because we developed a rapport. We were able to talk. I was finally, after a little bit of time, able to divulge to him my recovery story. But not only that, he just had a way of navigating these processes that were very, very easy. He also peppered his office with pamphlets and flyers and other information. I knew nothing about opioid-induced constipation until I read about it on his office wall. I'm just saying, no other doctor talked to me about that. And while I was seeing him, let me just say, I saw a lot of ologists. That's what I like to call them, ologists. I saw a rheumatologist, a nephrologist, a urologist. Those are all my ologists. And if I came to them with like a condition, they would help me. But here is somebody who actually sat down and talked to me and got a pen and paper out and did diagrams with me. He even laughed at me because he knew that I hated needles. And if I came into the office and told him about another doctor I saw that had struggled to give me a needle or put an IV in me, he would just down and out laugh at me and be like, they don't know about you. They don't know. And he was Russian, so his accent was really cute. But it is the building community that you should get from your medical provider. Like, I need to be able to talk to you. I need to get to know you, and I need to be able to talk to you. I should not be scared to tell you something that might be beneficial to my care and treatment. I know there's a process where you get to know your providers, but that process should happen. And it should move forward beautifully. And like I said, I was with that man for 10 years, and I actually cried when he shut down his office, but he wanted to go play golf in Florida. So, I mean, he made his contribution. So I let him go with my blessings, and I'm telling him to go to Disney World for me. But that's what you need. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Erin and Skip. That was great. So I guess bouncing off of that, this one's for Chris and Kavita. Like, what are the various ways that you communicate with your members, in what ways you feel like that's most effective?
I mean, as I mentioned before, the fact that there are so many different channels to be able to communicate with people these days is both a blessing and a curse, right? Because 20 years ago, when you designed communications and dissemination strategies, there were three main ways. It was television, newspaper, and radio, because people all learned in that capacity and got their news or information in that way. These days, everybody likes to get information in a different way. Some people want it through, as I mentioned earlier, social media. Some people rely on the news. Some people want to read online. Some people want still the newspaper. Like it's just a very, there are just so many different options available. So a challenge, for a small advocacy organization like ours is really trying to understand who your audience is and the ways in which they want to get that information. So you really need to kind of keep your finger on the pulse with people, and you're not going to be able to reach everyone every time with every bit of information, but doing the best that you can to really understand how people want to receive that information, and not just how, but how frequently. we are all now the recipients of, daily emails and text messages and phone calls and 1,000 other things. We just have information overload. We're very conscientious about that at our organization. You do have to put out a lot of information in order to reach a small percentage of that group. But at the same time, we don't want people to feel like we're spamming them or we're just constantly bombarding them with information or requests. So we really try to be conscientious about that. So as I mentioned, we just have a variety of different ways, right? We have information on our website. We email people. We put out information through social media. We have brochures for patients. We've done online guides and printed guides for patients. We have put continuing medical education courses in place for healthcare providers. So it's just a variety of different ways. But as I mentioned earlier, there is a real need not just to reach the people in your organization or people who have signed up to get information from you, because with any one condition, whether it's cancer, Parkinson's, chronic pain, substance use, there's only a very small percentage of people that have that condition that are actually getting information from your organization. So we really need to start thinking more broadly, just like we're encouraging scientists. And as Kavitha really nicely laid out, we can't rely on just doing a study, publishing a paper, presenting it at a scientific meeting, and then thinking that everybody's going to learn about it or know about it, because it's just not the case. In the same way, we really need to think about getting information, of course, to people who are receiving it from our organizations, but thinking more broadly about, who are those major groups of people that need that information, and how can we extend our reach more broadly into the community and make sure that people have a higher chance of getting that information from us.
I don't have anything to add to what Chris said. Very nicely stated. I'd say AAPM&R does things very similarly in terms of pushing things out in various forms to our channels and our members. But Chris is absolutely right that we have to start thinking more broadly about who the key stakeholders are. With limited resources, as every organization has, that is a challenge for us and for everyone involved. But I think one step in the right direction is being a part of things like this, like Heal Connections, and sharing important work through these channels, because this is just one more method of reaching an audience that we otherwise would not have been able to reach.
Well, there is an example of great minds think alike. So thank you both for sharing. So now I have a question again for our panel, our lived experience panelists. Can you tell us how you prefer to receive information that keeps you current on research about pain? That's kind of going off of what our association partners have shared.
Yeah, so for me, I think there's a few different ways I prefer taking or absorbing pain research. Like I said, I think talking with my doctor is really important, and it's really, really helpful when they are aware of the different kinds of research that are going on, and can explain that to me. But I also I think simplified content on social media is important. Infographics, video content, flyers and pamphlets that are like clear and not too wordy, but kind of get the point across in a doctor's office or kind of even just online, I think is really helpful. I think across the board, a lot of people with chronic pain probably don't have the time or the bandwidth to sit down and read a research paper. It's also, it's pretty hard to, when you're not really familiar with the way that researchers talk, to understand what they're saying. I know that's something that it took me time to develop as I became more involved as a student researcher. But before I was in 8th grade, I would read these papers and I had no idea what they were saying. And so finding ways to translate that information into readable content that is eye-catching and maybe has some sort of hook that brings readers in is really helpful. And I think that kind of content is especially useful when you already don't have a lot of energy to be doing much else except for focusing on your health and getting better.
Yeah, and thank you so much for sharing. Well, I guess with that, I can kind of jump back to our association partners. Like in listening to Erin, how can researchers build the infrastructure and support for dissemination? What goes into good collaboration with research teams? And what does that look like? Specifically thinking about, they want different channels and how they want information presented. How can we think about that dissemination?
I think, the landscape of research is changing. Another initiative that's going on at the National Institutes of Health right now is called Engage, that I'm co-chairing, and it's out of the director's office to put forward guidance and best practices for all clinical researchers on how to engage with communities and patients. And this is so important because we're really trying to change the paradigm of research, where it goes from the model that Kavitha was talking about earlier, where a scientist or a clinician scientist comes up with a research question, they get the grant, they design the study themselves, they conduct the study, they publish the paper, they present it and move on to the next, right? Where a paradigm where scientists and universities are constantly collaborating with community members, patients, caregivers, anyone that's going to be an end user of the data that's coming out of their study. Our funding systems are just not set up that way right now to support that type of a research paradigm, but they are changing, and not just within the NIH, but within other federal agencies. So one thing that's important to note is that clinician scientists are not taught, they're not health communications experts. They don't learn that in their education and training. They are not taught about patient engagement. So these are additional things that they need to add to their research team in terms of bringing on health communications experts and thinking about we're constantly asking scientists to do more things with the same amount or less money than what they've had in the past, right? And it's not an excuse to say that they can't do it, or they shouldn't do it, or they don't have the time to do it. But we really need to think realistically about what resources and infrastructure we have to put in place in order to bring people who have expertise in that area in health communications and dissemination into research teams. So that's just a standard part, just like every scientist has a statistician that's part of his or her team. You're going to have somebody that's a health communication expert, or has a degree in that area that's part of the research team and is thinking about that from the time the study starts until the end. And so that's just a really important way that we just need to change the paradigm of all research, where we're thinking about it differently, where it's a constant bi-directional or omnidirectional partnership with communities, patients, caregivers, and the like, and that we're always constantly involved in this, bi-directional communication of the work that's being done, because there is just so much information out there and people are not necessarily getting the information that they need in order to make informed decisions for themselves.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, exactly what we need to be thinking about.
Well, thank you so much. So our next question is again for our lived experience panelists. So you all have mentioned the formats like social media, also pamphlets, things like that. And so my question for you is, if you're in a waiting room for a medical provider or other locations, and you pick up, how likely are you to pick up a pamphlet, flyer, or other types of handouts that contain information relevant to you? And if you do, what is it about that information that makes you want to read it?
It's very likely because, first of all, we want to participate in our own care. We do not come from the school where we cannot participate in our own care. And I know that that's the way a lot of systems of care originated, where we weren't participating, we weren't allowed to participate, and our voice was not heard. Today we have voices and we speak up. One thing I like to do, I'm nosy. I'm sorry, I'm nosy. I go anywhere, and if you got something posted on the wall or a flyer laying on the table, I want to pick it up and I want to read it, especially if it concerns something that I might be getting into. Case on point, I went to my new pain management doctor last month, and he had a whole wall of pamphlets about the different procedures and things he does. I took every one of them and started reading them while I was waiting for him to come and see me, and started getting scared because some of those procedures sounded truly horrifying. So that's the first thing are you doing any of this stuff to me? Like, is this something we need to talk about? And he said, Ms. Skipper, you can put all of those back because they don't apply to you, but this one does. Let's talk about this. See, I like a practitioner who's willing to not look at the time and say, I only got 15 minutes for every patient, but who is willing to talk about everything, break down medical expressions and phrases into common everyday language. When I was diagnosed with this rare kidney disorder called retroperitoneal fibrosis, nobody spoke that word to me. They spoke it in my presence. My case managers was there, and the doctors was talking to my case managers about what was wrong with me, and they said something about retro. And I said, well, what's that? Nobody told me that. I'm in the hospital bed, but you're not telling me. You're telling my case manager. No, you need to tell me. And because today we live in an informational age, there are many, many areas that we could go to look for information. I mean, we all know that Google is our best friend. And I don't know a day that doesn't go by when I don't Google something because I'm curious about it or I want to know about it. You know, and I think our practitioners should not only give us this information, but also instruct us on how to find more information.
Yeah, adding on to that, I actually don't think doctor's offices provide enough pamphlets or flyers. I can think of one office that regularly posts different clinical studies that are going on. I know I was at my chiropractic at Brigham and Women's, and they had a Pilates program specifically for people of hypermobility. And that was something that really caught my attention, I think, because it was accessible and easy. And, you know, they explained kind of straight to the point who this is for and what the benefits are. But I often find that doctors' offices don't even provide pamphlets to look at to begin with. And I think that is a problem because then you don't even know what to ask about or what to look for. Um, like like Skip said, it's really, I mean, sometimes it can be overwhelming, but it gives you the awareness of what's out there, and that can start a conversation with your provider about what treatments are make the most sense for you and what you can possibly pursue. And so I think that's something that researchers and clinicians need to collaborate more on to make sure that that information is actually getting to waiting rooms and offices and patient rooms. So
And pharmacies and
yeah.
places like that,
Mhm.
places where we'll be at. We'll be in doctor's office. We're going to pick up our meds. We'll be in these medical supply and these pharmacies. We'll be in Walmart. We'll be in CVS. You know, you should have signage. You should have pamphlets. I mean, before I went back to school and as a researcher, my favorite thing to tell my doctor was talk to me like I'm 3 years old and walk me through this. Now I don't have to say that to my doctor because now I recognize and understand some of the things that I can read and disseminate a research brief or a journal article myself. But there are other people who can't. So when we build these documents and these informational materials, um, let's use stuff that people can understand and recognize. Like we're living in a visual age, and it's also a digital age. So just like I can go to Facebook and get, because I like to buy shoes and get 50 million ads about places that sell shoes, use something like that, you know. Facebook, there's some type of algorithm where whatever you look up or whatever, now they turn around and they send you 50 million ads. we should try to figure out how to do that when like someone Googles something medical or looks up a medical expression or a phrase or something. When someone uses Wikipedia or Google or something like that, now flash them ads pertaining to what they was looking at. Like there's so many ways to disseminate information nowadays. Some of it right and exact and some of it a little questionable, but there are ways.
Hi, Eden. I just wanted to note that it would be a good time right now to go ahead and open to questions from our audience. And there's one question ready to go from Tom that I'll read out now. In your experience, what are the two top ways people with lived experience are empowered to actively participate in their own treatment?
I answered that in the chat. It's when you create a space for our voice, when you let us know that we matter and we are valid, when you realize that we are the experts in our own life and you let us step up and speak up about what are our needs and what we need and what how we want to do this. When you treat us as children who can't participate, that is not a good relationship. We are adults or young adults and we can participate. You just have to give us that space and that chance to participate. You'll be surprised at what comes out.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's most beneficial when my provider can recognize that I don't have a lot of control over the things that go on in my life. And so healthcare and deciding what I want to do for next steps is not something that I want forced upon me, but I want options and I want those options to be presented in a way that is approachable and if I have questions, I want those questions to be answered. And I think Skip is completely right that when you're kind of talked down to as if you don't really know what's going on, and sometimes that is the case. Like sometimes you really don't understand what's happening, and that's when a provider needs to explain that to you. But when patients are not taken seriously or not listened to or heard or validated, I think that makes it really easy to close yourself off to any potential options, even if they're there to help, because it's much easier to just protect yourself and not do anything new when you're feeling like your control is being taken away from you or it's being threatened in some way, than to take a risk and try something new without, the definite answer of this is going to work and this is going to help you. So I think it's really important to recognize that any decision-making process for people with chronic pain is a really personal thing, and it's honestly sometimes these decisions can be really, really hard to make, and so giving back as much of that power as you can to those patients is super important, because that is ultimately how people will be more receptive to new research and new treatment options, and just even having a conversation about pain and changing up the way that your day-to-day life looks like.
Oh, thank you both. I do have another question from Ashley, and this is for all the panelists. So since there are limited resources, wasting effort is a concern. So what are the things to avoid wasting our time on when it comes to getting research results to people who could use it? What should the NIH and researchers not waste time and effort on?
Something I read a lot when I'm looking at chronic pain literature, and again, I'm someone who is able to read that literature and understand it, is that at the end of a lot of these papers, a lot of researchers say something like, this study shows great potential for other researchers to keep exploring whatever treatment method that they're looking at, rather than this study is really important in addressing the way that people treat their pain. So less about actually getting this research to the people that are affected, but more about empowering other researchers to conduct similar research. And I think it's really easy for that if that cycle continues, it's really easy for people with lived experience to kind of get cut out of the cycle. And so focusing more time on connecting with people who have pain through some of the ways that we talked about, flyers, pamphlets, video content. I know for people my generation, TikTok is really a great way to communicate with younger people. And it's daunting. I get that. It is scary, even for someone like me who's very fluent in TikTok and social media. It can still be a lot, but communicating that way, podcasts are great. The Comfortability program, we actually have a podcast on pain for pediatric patients, and we're currently working on a second season. So focusing more attention on ways to disseminate the information that already exists versus generating new research on really advanced technology that is going to help a certain select few of people. Of course, that's really important, but I think there's sometimes an overemphasis on innovation over actually helping a broader group of people who are currently experiencing debilitating pain.
Great points, Erin. And I would just add to that it's hard for me to answer the question about what they're wasting time on because there's so many more things that we need. But I would say, referring back to what I mentioned earlier, which is not focusing on very broad things that aren't really going to reach who you need to reach, right? So thinking about a very focused strategy from the beginning. So what I'm referring to is, if you publish a study, you write up the paper, and I'm not saying you shouldn't do this, but just putting out a broad press release into the internet atmosphere is not going to reach the people that you need to reach. So really thinking through a dissemination and communication strategy. If this is a study on migraine, thinking about, okay, what's the age group? What are the gender? What's the ethnicity? What are the actual targeted folks that are going to benefit most from this, from reaching or from gaining this information that's come from the study? What types of clinicians? Does it need to go to neurologists? Does it need to go to primary care physicians? Do payers need to know about this? Do healthcare administrators need to know about it? Thinking through in a very strategic way. And you're not going to be able to reach everyone, right? Unless you have an unlimited communications budget, which most research groups do not have. You're not going to be able to reach everyone, but thinking about, okay, who are those top 3 groups that we really need to reach? And how do we put this information in a format, right? That's the other point that's very important. You cannot communicate at a college level to the public, right? Like you have to think about, how do I communicate the information that's coming out of the study in a clear way to the people who need it and in a way that's understandable to them? So I would just say, in terms of wasting time, I wouldn't think about broad strategies that are just going to go out there and not really reach anyone in specific, but really encouraging people, meet with the health communications folks and let them help you think through all of this information and, your target groups, the type of information, how to reach them, how to craft, whether it's videos or TikTok, stuff on TikTok or other social media methods. Like this is a science, right? There is a whole science of health communications. So really, I would encourage people to utilize those resources and think through that in a very strategic way.
Well, thank you so much. And hearing these perspectives is really great. And I think it lends into the next question really well. So this is from Jewel. And it says, in your experience, what are the effective ways in which researchers can partner with people with lived experience or build rapport within the community? How can they best serve their population and make those connections?
I think one way is to bring them to the table at the ideation phase of research happening, when researchers are thinking about what questions to answer and why these questions need to be answered. I believe at that stage is when individuals with lived experience need to be involved, but it needs to continue. That involvement needs to continue even throughout the research And I believe individuals with lived experiences should be a part of the writing as well. If they're not conducting the research, being a part of the analysis of the data, understanding the data, and having some input in the conclusions of the research. And like Erin said, a little less of what this didn't do, but a little more of how this research has helped. And I think coming from that perspective will really strengthen the publications as well.
Yeah, we hear from a lot of community members and patients this idea of swooping in and out. So scientists swoop into your community, they get you to participate in the study, you give them, what you need in terms of participation and, showing up to appointments, completing your surveys, giving them their data, and then you never hear from them again. And so that's the paradigm that I was referring to earlier that we need to change. Scientists need to have a more broad perspective about engaging with community members. They need to go into the community. They need to humble themselves and learn how to communicate with people in the lay public, right? They need to take courses and education on patient and community engagement, because that's also a science in addition to health communications. And like I said earlier, it's not necessarily fair to think, and to require every single scientist to do all of these things, but you can bring someone onto your team that can help you do these things and has the expertise in this area. And it really is just a paradigm shift about how we think about how science is planned, how it's conducted, and making it more bi-directional with the community. But it's never going to happen until scientists actually go into the community and establish these relationships. And it isn't just for, that 3 months while you're recruiting for your study, but it's a 12-month out of every year that you're involved in science, that you're actually, bi-directionally working with community members.
Adding on to all of that, I think more organizations need to have PWLE boards and panels that researchers can consult, and it doesn't have to be like a one-on-one interaction all the time, because that's probably very costly and time consuming for both researchers and for people with lived experience. But having some sort of established network for organizations that conduct research, where people with lived experience are actively, again, a part of the entire research process, from starting to formulate questions to figuring out the methods and actually conducting the study, and then data analysis and data presentation and dissemination. It's really important that people with lived experience are incorporated throughout that entire journey, and are not only consulted for one project, but for multiple projects, because that'll kind of help with consistency across the board for chronic pain research, and make it so that, researchers will better understand how to connect with people with lived experience who might not be a part of those boards or not have time or energy to do it, to participate in that way. And I think having a general shift towards understanding the perspective of people who have chronic pain, and changing everything from the language to how studies are conducted, is really important in order to continue reaching the people who are affected by the research.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing and giving all of your insight. So I have a question from Bob, and I think part of this question has been answered. So the first part of the question is, I'd love to hear the panelists' thoughts about what is important to them in terms of feedback and meaningful outcomes from their partnership with scientists. But the second part of the question I thought was really relevant is, how will researchers know whether our collaboration on this front are meaningfully improving the process and outcomes from these partnerships? How do we demonstrate added value?
Well, I'd just jump in first by saying that there are actual measures of engagement that can be used in science in and of itself. There's actually many of them that have been put forward. And we need to start standardly measuring it, not just measuring the PWLE experiences, but also the bidirectional experience of the science, the scientists, the research team, the science itself, and how all of that has changed by including persons with lived experience in partnership in that. And then secondly, to report on it, because patient engagement has been going on for a very long time, but it hasn't always been measured and reported on. And so we've had, it's unfortunate because we could have learned a lot from what has happened in many different communities over the last number of decades. And I think we could be further along in establishing best practices and guidance for other communities and conditions for which patient engagement or community engagement is lacking. And so I would start there as the measurement piece, including actual measurement tools within your studies and within your work with the community and people with lived experience. And then secondly, reporting on that.
I think as a patient, it's really important to continually reach out, and not just for the short term, so like 6 months or a year, but for many years, and get their advice and perspective on the progress of research and how, if they've experienced any changes in the way that they interact with new information. I think this is when a board might come in handy, because you can kind of see the changes long term, whereas in the short term it might kind of be harder to gauge that, and because the research process takes so long, these changes that we've been discussing are going to take a long time. And so incorporating people with lived experience, not just for a short period of time, but for extended periods of time, and just checking in all the time, asking feedback, is really important. And I think probably going to be the most helpful way of understanding whether or not these changes and collaborations are actually making a difference.
Thank you all so much. And I think this is also this is a great segue into the next question from Heather. And this is for all panelists. And she says, as a person, myself, who struggles with lived pain, with struggles with pain, I can imagine being involved with research projects can sometimes bring false hope or feel like a roller coaster, or also feel like research is taking too long. Has that come up for any of you? And how do you address that or communicate about the progress or lack thereof in a compassionate and clear way?
I think this is a great point, and it goes back to a lot of what we were discussing earlier in pain, which is the state of pain science right now is not where it needs to be. There's so much that we don't know about the underlying mechanisms of pain and the treatments for pain. It's not like we have very clear algorithms, for treatment for pain. And so that's one of the difficulties that we have in communicating the findings of science to the community of folks who have chronic pain and the usefulness that they get from it. Because a lot of the studies right now, as Erin mentioned earlier, it's like, this study showed X and it's worthy of additional study. Well, what does a patient with pain actually do with that? It's not like, oh, we had this ginormous clinical trial which showed efficacy of this treatment, that treatment, this one, and here are the patients who should be utilizing these treatments. We're not there yet. HEAL has done a great job in terms of advancing the science of pain, and we're getting there. But right now, there's a lot of things that are published around pain research that are more just informational. They're not things that patients can actually take action on, right? And so I think the point that Heather made is very well it's well stated, and it is a reality of research in that it just takes a long time to do research. When I graduated with a science degree and went to Hopkins to do research when I was 21, and I thought we were going to find the cure for chronic pain, and I was there 3 years, and at year 2, I finished my first study 2 years in, right? Like, so you learn how long research actually takes to conduct, and not just conduct, but analyze, summarize, write it up, get it out into the community is usually, like I said, at least 5 years. So we need to do a better job of, getting information out as quickly as possible, And I actually had a, kind of a question off of that for Aaron and Helen. And I guess it really is, given that we don't have a lot of like actionable information that's coming out of pain studies right now, like, do you still want to know about that? Like, do you want to know that this study found this mechanism was involved in this type of pain just for informational purposes? Or does it just discourage you when you don't feel like the science that we have right now is giving you clear answers? Like, I should try treatment A, C, and L, right? Instead of B, D, and E.
Yeah, I think, well, there's two things I've been thinking about. So the first, to answer the original question, I think reframing the way that research is conducted could potentially work towards addressing this issue, and potentially breaking down a long-term project into shorter periods where research can be analyzed, even if it's smaller cohorts at a time, or changing how research studies are done so that more people receive potential benefits versus just a placebo group, which obviously is important in the validity of a study and everything. But I think that can potentially really help in just having people more involved in research, but also keeping people encouraged. If there's a more constant flow of information, that is going to be so much more beneficial than waiting 10 years for this huge study that has so much information. Like, it's better to receive smaller amounts over a more consistent period of time versus waiting for a huge breakthrough. And that's hard, and I get that. And it's not something that we can always control. But I think that's really important. And in terms of your question, Kristen, I think it is helpful to know what isn't working. And it is helpful to know when research does not lead to a new treatment that's really effective. Because for a lot of people, including myself, we're just kind of left with no information, or very little information. And negative results are still something that we can absorb and use to inform our decisions. Like, if there's something about a study that says this treatment isn't effective, then maybe that'll apply to other types of treatments within a similar realm. And maybe that'll help you decide, okay, maybe I'm going to try something else first that has more consistent results versus trying this method that has not had a lot of promising results. And I think because we're often left with so little to work with in terms of information to guide our next steps, any information is going to be greatly appreciated, so long as it's not presented in a way that limits hope or limits someone's thinking about the future of chronic pain research. I think it has to be presented in a very approachable way, and with the idea that, okay, maybe this study showed that this treatment doesn't work right now, but that there are other potential routes in the future that will be looked into. And so not only presenting that negative information, but contextualizing it in the broad scheme of things, and making sure that you're not just kind of leaving people feeling defeated is important. So presentation, the way that you talk about it, is just as important as the actual results.
Before we move on, I just wanted to give Kavitha and Skip a quick time to kind of maybe jump in on this, especially with their research on long COVID and working in that space. Like, I know this could be really up and down for individuals. So I just wanted to kind of give you a moment to take the floor.
Sure, thank you. I agree on continuing to share information and bite-sized pieces of information as research is being conducted, especially in the long COVID space. NIH has funded something called the Recover trial that is going to take years and years and years for results to come out. But we need to hear what's happening at these institutions today. And I think there is a way to do it. Our very small way of doing it was to bring clinicians and clinics and patients together monthly to just talk about what they're doing and to develop consensus publications while we wait for more foundational research to be completed. And I think that's a way that more researchers can get engaged. We have to share more boots on the ground information, like what people are doing while they're waiting for large pieces of evidence to come out there. And that, I think, will help spark more conversations.
Yes, thank you for that. And I'd also like to say that actual research is a long process, from developing a proposal to shopping it around to getting funded, waiting for the funds to go in. And I think in order to garner more participation, it's vital to realize that when you are involving those of us with lived experiences, we need to be involved in the whole thing, not just from the bottom up or from the top down. Like when you're building a proposal, we need to be involved. When you're searching for IRB approval, we need to be involved. As you're building the research protocol, the survey questions, the quantitative portion, the qualitative focus groups, and things like that, we need to be involved. And that is a way of keeping us involved, because these things take time. Don't just bring us in at the last minute and say, here's this finished piece of business. Take this and shop this around. You are our lived experience consultant. Go out there and get us people. No, things don't work like that. Like, involve us from the beginning so that we are more invested in the process and we grow and we develop. Because when you involve us, it's not just using our expertise as having lived through these experiences. You're also giving us professional development and capacity building. And I think more of those activities need to be included. When I first was introduced to research through Urban Institute, and I am still affiliated with them, I am still a consultant with them. They not only involved us in all processes, they also trained us. So instead of just talking about expressions like participatory research and things like that, they trained us in it. So we were not just sitting there as the people with lived experience, we were sitting there as someone who had expertise, because our capacity was built and we were trained in the processes. And that could be another way to get people more fully involved and sticking and staying, because we all know sometimes the research is boring. Is that the researcher that I am will definitely admit that sometimes it is boring, but these are just other snippets that can bring us more fully in. And you'd be surprised of how many people you have who have lived experience who now want to move into this type of work, into this type of career, because we've been fully introduced. We've been trained. Our capacity has been built. So research should not just about including the voices of those with lived experience. You should have an also secondary goal of building the capacity of those with lived experiences.
Well, thank you all so much. I really appreciate all of the questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but I want to thank you all so much, and I'm going to turn it back over to Sierra.
Great. Thank you so much again to the panelists for sharing your insights and experiences. I want to say, please take our survey to share your feedback on today's session. You can use the QR code on that slide, or Natalie just put it into the chat box as well. Your feedback can help us design, contribute to, and improve our programming. And stay tuned for an immediate follow-up with the link and reminder to fill out our evaluation. And then in 2 weeks, we'll send the full recording from today's discussion. And we hope that many of you will be able to join us for the second part of this series on October 10th. That session will focus on opioid use disorder. The link to register is in the chat, or you can follow that QR code, and will also be sent out in our follow-up emails. Have a great afternoon.